So the next disability category that we'll consider is intellectual disabilities. For a long time, folks with intellectual disabilities or limited intellectual functioning were referred to using some language that we try to avoid now. And so the previous term was mental retardation. Hopefully I don't have to spend any amount of time convincing you all that the word retarded is not really an appropriate term to use any longer. We could go into a much longer segment about how language and the meaning of language changes over time. And so there's periods in time where we stop using previously acceptable language. But again, I doubt I need to convince anyone of that. So we talk about intellectual disabilities. Someone with an intellectual disability presents in two ways. One is significantly limited intellectual functioning, and so we would begin to consider someone with an intellectual disability with an IQ of 70 or below. And then second, also with severe limitations of adaptive behavior. So behaviors like communication, self-care, self-management, the ability to use transportation, the ability to cook and clean and generally take care of themselves. There's issues with the IQ test, right? Not unlike the AC test, any test that predicts or defines reality that's based on one pinpoint of data at one time. I think there's some problems with doing that. I think defining reality for students based on one measure is not a great idea. And so that's why, or part of the reason why we use this sort of double-pronged approach, that it's not just intellectual ability, it's also limitations in these other areas. So a student with an intellectual disability, I think a lot of times we sort of default to someone with Down syndrome. I don't think that's a very appropriate default to have. I know lots of people with Down syndrome that have really achieved some cool things in life, gone to college, drive, live independently, and have fantastic lives. And those folks may not perform well on an IQ test because of things related to deficits in speech and the inability to be understood in speech that really don't have a lot to do with their intellectual functioning. And so I think there's some troubling things there. I think there's some things that will grow from a lot in the future. Now, probably when we get into students with severe intellectual disability, these are the types of students that we've talked about, that 85% of students with disabilities can be easily served, 15% can be a little harder to serve. But I think it's important to find ways to include people with intellectual disabilities within our classrooms, though this is a category where we may need some resources, right? We may need a curriculum that's already been adapted. So I recently had a conversation with friends. They're a homeschool family that utilize the Mother of Divine Grace homeschools services and support, and that organization has a curriculum that's been adapted that covers the same content and moves students with intellectual disabilities along with exposure to that information. And I think there's ways to do that within the classroom. I know there's ways to do that so that we can educate students who may have a limited intellectual capacity alongside their age-appropriate and school-aged peers. It does take a little more work and perhaps some more resources. Two of the things that we know about, sort of broadly about folks with intellectual disabilities that can really, if we just shift a little bit, can change their outcomes pretty significantly. And the first has to do with generalization. And so if I'm in a classroom full of college-age students, when we introduce this topic, I always ask them about the cars that they drive. And I tell them about my old 1976 Ford. And somebody will drive a Honda, and somebody will drive a Toyota, and somebody has a Chevy pickup. And so I hear from 3 or 4 people, and then I pick on one of them and I say, could you take another student, so let's say, could the Honda driver take the Chevy pickup driver's car to the gas station and put gas in it? And most of the time the students nod yes, we could do that. And that's because we can generalize, right? We can learn something in one environment or one context, and we can transfer that to another environment or another context. And students with intellectual disabilities don't always have that capacity. And so if we're working on life skills or job skills, it's important to teach those skills within the natural environment of that student, the place where they're going to use those skills. And so generalization is something that's important for us to think about. The other is our ability to learn incidentally. And so we just kind of carry on the fueling of the car story in this conversation. And I ask students how many of them can remember a particular day where their parent took them to a gas station to teach them how to put fuel in their car. And there are some students who say, oh yeah, I remember one day my dad took me to the filling station and made me fill up the tank. And then there's some students that are like, I think I just knew how to do it. And that's certainly my experience. I don't think anybody ever said, open the gas cap door, take off the gas cap, slide your credit card into the, I don't think I had a step-by-step. I think I just watched my dad do it over a long period of time, and so I learned. That's called incidental learning, or learning from the environment. The things that we pick up because we've seen someone else do it, or we've seen it modeled in the environment. And students with intellectual disabilities, also students with visual impairments and hearing impairments, have a hard time learning incidentally because they're not aware. Certainly the folks with the sensory impairments aren't able to see or hear what's going on around them. And a student with an intellectual disability may not focus in on this is what's going on somewhere else. And so we can't make assumptions about student learning if we haven't taught that, because maybe they haven't picked it up. And so I have my students do an activity here where I have them pick a simple task, like brushing your teeth or making a peanut butter sandwich. And I give them 5 or 7 minutes in class to write out all the steps to do those things. And then I pick on a couple groups and have them present the steps. And it's never detailed enough, right? It always assumes incidental learning. Like they'll say, remove the lid from the peanut butter jar. Well, how do we take a lid off the peanut butter jar? If you've never seen that or never done that, righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, this is a new concept. And so for students with intellectual disabilities, we have to really analyze. The process is called task analysis. We really have to analyze the things that we're trying to teach them and break them down into the smallest steps possible. And so if I was working with someone with an intellectual disability and maybe we were learning how to do some job skill. The example I use is that I'm a job coach and I'm working with someone who's gotten a job at the UPS store. And it's their job to package things that are going to be shipped out. The customers have brought in and said, hey, will you box this up and have it shipped out? And so some of the tasks that are required would be to selecting the appropriate box size, assembling the box, using appropriate packing materials, and then taping up the box and putting the label on it. And so if I was teaching that job to someone I was working with as a job coach, we would do that job together over and over and over. And I would start them with the first step. And so let's say we had 100 things to ship. I'm going to have that person pick the appropriate box every single time until they get it right, and consistently get it right. And that's the only step I'm going to have them do. I'm going to talk them through the rest of the steps, but until there's mastery of the first step, that's the only step they're working on. And then we would introduce the second step and all of the way until the end of that. And so that's, if we're thinking about teaching a process to someone with an intellectual disability, we have to break it down by steps. We have to teach each individual step to mastery. And think about complex things that we learn how to do. I'm not a language learner. I'm not good at learning foreign languages because it's one of these very complex tasks where we're bringing together both the written word and the pronunciation of the word, and then the speaking of the word, and then we've got the vocabulary to learn on top of that. And for me, it's one of those things that I just can't learn unless I'm doing. And so in the times of my life when I've lived in another country that's spoken a language, I've been able to pick it up, but I can't really learn it in an academic setting. Similarly, as I study music, I play a couple of stringed instruments and I take lessons every week. I've been playing for 20 years. I still take lessons every week because it's one of those things that I can't just watch someone play a complex song and be like, okay, and now I know how to play that. I have to break it down, right? I have to learn the chords, and then I have to learn the fingering that goes with those chords. And there's songs that I've been working on this classical song for a couple months now, and I think my pets and my children are ready to kill me because all I do is sit down for a half an hour at the time and do this over and over again. And that's not unlike the way we would teach someone with an intellectual disability. So again, methods that work for lots of people, but are specifically necessary when we think about students with intellectual disabilities. These are also students where we might seek out in the Catholic schools, we might seek out a partnership with the public schools. So perhaps this is a student who's at the Catholic school most of the day, but for a little bit of the day goes to a public school. Or we might even look at a student who would do their K through high school experience in the private school and then do a post-high school program in the public school that was aimed at functional and employment and life skills. So this is one of those areas that we might need some extra support, that just things that we as teachers can do in a classroom might not quite be enough. We may need a modified curriculum, or we might want to access some supports outside of our Catholic schools to ensure the success for these individuals.